Hi, this is a quick overview of Dipesh Chakrabarty's The Climate of History, four theses. His fundamental tension in the work is between thinking of humans as a species and almost a universalization of the human, and thinking historically, which has the specificities of cultures and human interactions over particular times. These two don't sit well with each other, but the climate crisis is, as we'll see in the essay, it forces them to come together. So, at the beginning, in the first kind of thesis, he's interested in the problem of how historians think of history is normally that humans are actors on a stage, and nature as the stage is the backdrop. Nature is often seen as having, quote, no inside. That is, it has no interiority, it has no intention, and it has no agency. So, how is it then that nature seems to be pushing back? And on the other side, it's the humans who we've thought of as individuals or as groups, but now humans as a whole species seem to wield a geological force, or as Michel Serres has said in The Natural Contract, humans weigh like tectonic plates. So here is this tension between nature being no longer a backdrop but seeming to be active, and humans having a geological effect. Then in the second thesis, he looks at the Anthropocene as it qualifies humanist histories of modernity and globalization. So here he's thinking of the modern freedoms that we think as free, but often stand on extraction economies, fossil fuels, for example, and coals. So, in some ways, he asks, is the Anthropocene a critique of the narrative of freedom? That is, it isn't totally free, it's extractive from a commons and the common earth. The other critique is that he brings up is the Enlightenment reason, which we strongly need. He says we need reason to help get us through, sits at odds with a politics that was also born of the Enlightenment, the politics of democracy and a politics that globalizes. In the third thesis, it is the geology of the Anthropocene requires us to connect capitalism with the history of the human species. And this is really where he gets to this kind of tension, that humanists see discrete groups of humans. For example, humanity is polarized between the rich and the poor, or between the global north and the global south. Whereas scientists are saying we have to think of humans as geologically weighing on the earth, and as a natural force, and as a species. So historians see a distinction between humans, while scientists have focused on the species as a whole as it relates to the rest of nature. And the humanist critique has been, doesn't the talk of species or mankind simply serve to hide over or gloss over a reality of capitalist productions? Particular capitalist countries have caused this problem. Now the rest of the world has to suffer. So this is sort of talked through a bit in that section. But one of the responses is interesting. He says, no, it's not just humans that are involved in human innovations. And he looks at the agricultural revolution in 10,000 BC, the rise of agriculture. The agricultural revolution of 10,000 BC is not simply a human innovation, but it's made possible by the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, stable climate, degrees of warming of the planet after the Ice Age. In other words, there are a lot of geological forces that are kind of agents of change or facilitating change. So it's not simply humans who are the agents of history or facilitating history. So climate change is calling us to think simultaneously about chronologies of capitalism and chronologies of species history. It's forcing these two different speeds, capitalism and species history, forcing these two speeds to come together and asking us to think them together. And that leads to the third thesis, which is the cross between species history and the history of capital, and it probes the limits of our historical understanding. How does it probe these limits? And there are a few interesting points here. One is that we experience history as meaningful only to the degree that we can reconstruct it and reenact the experience in our own minds. In other words, if we can imagine that history, Walter Benjamin says, all history is history from the present. In other words, the present, us now, are looking back and trying to understand past moments. But we see it always through our lens. It's the only lens we know. So, to the degree that we can begin to understand the past, it's only through our present moment. The problem being that the past, the long past of species, and the possibilities of future and the future collapse and danger from climate change, is hard for us to think or experience or reconstruct or reenact. Now, the specific experiences that we have, we experience specific effects of the crisis of climate change. So we have these small experiences, but we can never experience the whole of it, right? The whole arc of it, nor its finality. And species then becomes, and this is how he ends it, species is the placeholder for an emergent new universal humans that emerge from climate danger. We can never understand this universal of either the universal of climate change or the universal of this placeholder of what we're calling the human. But it seems to be an effect or something necessary alongside climate change. So his challenge is, how can historians, Chakrabarty being a historian, University of Chicago, how can historians think through this problem? And this section also concludes with an interesting question: is who is the we? We humans have never experienced ourselves as species. We've experienced ourselves as individual groups. So who is the we of we in climate change and in this particular history? I'll leave you with that. The language in the essay can be complicated, but if you follow through the thesis and keep in mind throughout that he's trying to relate the problem of history and how historians think of people, and the problem of species as it relates to climate change, and the relationship between those two, and how it affects the humanist understanding of history.